All right, so let's get started. First, on the shifter side or the left side of the bike, you're going to need a couple things that come out of your kit. One, you're going to need the plates. These obviously aren't coated yet, but you get the idea. This is just the original prototype set that has been cut over and over and over, but these are going on this bike. There is a direction for these. The squared off pieces goes down here at the bottom, so the rounded off tip is toward the front of the bike, and the square tip is down. Let's see here. The square tip is down towards the bottom. You're going to need 2 of the larger bolts, M10 bolts, and the nylon lock nuts. You're also on this side going to need your shift linkage extension. So what this is going to do is this is going to thread onto your shifter rod on one side and then thread into the shifter on the other. So first thing, I'm going to take a 14 millimeter and we're going to pull this original assembly off. Now that this is off of here, I like to, and this is already loose for me, pull this shifter off because it makes changing this thing out a whole lot easier. So you're going to want to pull this bolt out of the back side of the shifter, the shifter lever itself, and then it should pop right out of the peg. Set this piece aside for a moment. Now what you're going to want to do is take this and actually unthread it from your OEM shift linkage. This will give you the opportunity to put in your new linkage extension. All right, so now the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your extension and you're going to want to thread it right down into the shifter. That's all the way down in there snug. I suggest using some blue Loctite down inside of that. Now you're going to take that piece and you're going to thread it onto, which this is the tricky part. You have to line those threads up perfect, and then it goes on. You can see here it's starting to thread on the OEM shift linkage. Let's see here. Okay, now move this jam nut down. You're going to use your OEM bolts. You're going to thread those right back into the frame with your plate, your extension plate, on here. Next thing, you're going to take, and I always slide my shifter back on, temporarily put this bolt back in to hold the shifter in place. Okay. Now, take your first bolt and put it in the top of the foot control, and then it slides into place. All right, once you have those bolts threaded in, you're going to take the nylon inserted nuts. You're going to slide them on the back. You'll take a 17 millimeter wrench. And basically, at this point, this side is pretty much done. You'll do a little bit of adjustment here with your shifter if you need to. So you can actually adjust your shifter here, or if you remove the cover back here where the shifter's at, you can actually make some adjustments there as well. But pretty much, this leaves your shifter in the spot where it's ready to work as it did from the factory. Just make sure you tighten this jam nut up. So let's go ahead and go over to the brake side. All right, before you actually start this side, there's a modification to this brake pedal that's been made that is going to allow for you to use this forward control extension. Number one, it's better to do this while all this stuff is still bolted up because it actually gives you a little more leverage. But what you're going to want to do is take your brake arm, and there's a bend here and there's a bend here. And you're going to want to bend this up. Just use leverage, and you're going to want to bend that up. You can use a cheater bar, you can use whatever, to bend this lever up the other way. Once you do that, this peg is actually going to be sitting up a little bit. At that point, that's when I make sure I use a cheater bar, I stick it on the peg, bend the peg back down straight. And what that's going to do is allow your peg to be a little longer. It's also going to create a little bit of clearance here so that it doesn't hit this bracket. It actually goes that way. but it allows it to give some clearance so it doesn't hit this bracket. This was the first prototype and it's straight. The new one has a little bit of a cup to it to provide a little more clearance, but you still need to bend this brake lever just a little bit to provide enough clearance so when you hit your brake, you're not rubbing your brake on your extension. So really, that's the only modification you need to make to any of the factory parts to make any of this fit. So again, just like we did on the shifter side, let's go ahead and take this stuff apart. A couple things that make this job a little bit easier is a 12mm gear wrench, because to get the bolt out that runs through this brake arm, it's all the way up underneath here. You can use a regular box end wrench, it just takes you a little longer, but you'll notice I'll use this gear wrench and it makes quick work of this really quick, or it makes quick work of this, of pulling that bolt out. But first things first, I usually like to try to break that free so that everything is still solid. I'll stick my wrench up under here and break that bolt free. Let me see if I can get a close-up on that. All right, so from here you can kind of see that this is the shaft, like the collar that's on this brake lever, and on the very back side of this, there's a 12mm bolt that's up underneath it here. So right where my finger's at, you can touch the bolt, but you're going to need to make sure you get some sort of box end wrench down in there to be able to get to that. Like I said, I use a 12mm gear wrench to make this pretty quick. Let me pull that apart real fast. So I back that bolt out so that it's now loose. You can pull it back apart because both of these brackets have to come off. Well, this one has to come off, this one's gonna come loose. So that being said, let me grab my impact and we're gonna pull that off. All right, so there's 3 bolts in this. The middle bolt actually holds these 2 brackets together, which then in turn holds the brake and all that stuff together. So you can actually pull this out now, but you're gonna need to take, this is a 10mm. You're gonna take this 10mm and you'll back this out here in just a second. But for right now, it's best to leave that in there. At this point, take a 10mm. You're gonna take this M6 bolt out at the bottom. And what this does is it holds the outer foot control bracket and the inner foot control bracket that also holds the brake arm or the brake assembly together, so it's easier to put on. But you're no longer going to need that. Here's also a good time, since you had this loose. Now you can pull this bolt out. And you don't need to pull it all the way out, you're just going to want to pull it loose because it's actually threaded into the foot control bracket. You're putting the brake bracket on, you're going to get a small little M6x1 bolt that goes in the middle hole here. And what that's going to do is it works as a set pin here. It actually fits down in there, and then you can put your brake bolt in. So what'll happen is this will thread in here. Now, all of these bolts, again, I'm going to say this over and over. Make sure you're using Loctite on these. I'm not, because we're just doing a quick assembly, and all this stuff has to come back off to go to powder coat. But nonetheless, make sure you're using some Loctite on these bolts. Next, I found it's best to take this assembly, and you're going to want to mount your peg, loosely mount your peg to your bracket. Again, the rounded section is forward, facing forward. And I just, get the nuts on the back to just where the nylon touches. They don't have to be completely tight, just to kind of hold it together. And then what you're going to do is, you're going to want to, because it's a little easier to thread because this hole right here is tapped. And what you want to do is, you want to take, all of this stuff is going to end up fitting together. So you're going to want to take this bolt with your fingers out here and line it up and start to thread it into that plate. Once it starts to thread into that plate, you'll feel it grab. Again, take your 12mm. And you're going to want to thread that up into the brake bracket. And it doesn't need to be tight because at this point, everything is still kind of loose and you have to line it up going into the frame. So now you'll tuck your brake assembly back down in there. You'll grab one of your OEM bolts. These can actually come out now to provide access for you to get to those OEM frame bolts. And really the only reason I put these in is because it's easier to line up this brake bolt with these just held into this plate. So now you can take your OEM bolts and your extension, which I just dropped. Again, square part is back, rounded part is forward. Put that into the OEM slot. Put the bottom one into the OEM slot. Now at this point, again, I'll say this again, I'll probably say this on through all these, make sure these frame bolts you put Loctite back on them. But now what's going to happen is this foot control is now going to line itself up to this bracket. You already have your brake bolt running through this brake arm shaft back here, and it's loose. So it's best now to go ahead and line these front holes up, and you'll see really quickly now that all of this is kind of sorted together why you bent this brake arm, and I'll show you here in just a second. These won't necessarily need Loctite because they have nylon nuts on them. So now that all this is pulled together, you're going to want to do a few things. Tighten up this bolt, this 12 millimeter. Actually, I think that's a 13 millimeter. I got the wrong one here. You're going to want to tighten this up. Make sure you Loctite that bolt. And now you're going to reach up in here with your gear wrench, your 12 millimeter gear wrench, and you're going to want to turn this brake bolt until it is tight. And what it's doing is it's threading into this brake plate. At this point, you pretty much have everything installed. But you'll see when you hit your brake lever, when you bent this out, it keeps it from clearing this 1/4 inch brake extension plate. And basically the same alignment, and I showed you guys in a Facebook Live video this past week. Your foot basically now has to come up to hit the brake, but that's pretty much the same parallel that the R brake is with the floorboards. So at this point, the installation's done. Obviously, it's a little easier now since I have a lift here and I'm up off the ground, but every bit of this can be done on the ground. The brake side obviously is a little more difficult. It's good if you have an extra set of hands, somebody that can hold onto the handlebars while you bend this bracket up, and then get yourself a cheater pipe to get on here and bend this brake lever back down to provide clearance here. But you'll see that this is obviously the first run, and it's flat, but the plates you'll get will have a small divot in them to clear the brake arm as it comes down, so you won't have to bend it as far, bend the brake lever back as far. Something else to note, make sure all of the factory bolts you took out, so the bolt in the brake that went through this brake lever shaft, the bolts that are in the frame, and then the other side, the bolts that are in the frame as well as the shifter bolt are all Loctited. Make sure you put some blue Loctite on those before you put those bolts in. With that, this kit is available on GoheenCycles.com. Like you see here, these aren't powder coated, but they're all powder coated black. These were the original prototypes, but the install is exactly the same. If you have any questions, you can hit us up at GoheenCycles.com, GoheenCycles@gmail.com, or on our Instagram at GoheenCycles. Thanks again for stopping by. Anything you may have, throw them down in the comments section, and I'll see you guys next time.